intersection of athletic science, traditional martial arts, and niche investing. That intro goes out to Arthur Cauty, who's never heard a mandolin growl before. Anyways, this week I'm going to talk oil, specifically the link between oil and GDP. The exercise section will focus on back safety in the deadlift because I had a fellow gym goer express concern when I mentioned that I was going to be pushing for a PR of just over 2 times my body weight soon. He mentioned Ronnie Coleman's back injuries, which started from a herniated disc. I figured it'd be a good little topic to look into, so I'm going to start with that. So I started out by checking out Ronnie's history of back injuries, and he's got a number of interviews on YouTube. And in one of them I saw him mention that the first time he got a herniated disc was back in high school, and is actually quite a surprising number of people will have herniated or bulged discs throughout their 20s and more in their 30s and 40s that have no symptoms or pain whatsoever. The real injuries of this come when the herniated or bulging disc starts to pinch against nerves, and that can lead to its own set of complications. But herniated discs by themselves are not injury or a reason to lay off on weights. The most common interview I see from Ronnie is one which appears to have been from a time when he was already on the pro bodybuilding circuit. It sounded pretty unpleasant. You can check it out on your own time if you'd like. He said that he was on rep 8 of 15 when it happened. So he was obviously on a bodybuilder's routine and not a powerlifter's. I have no idea how much he was pushing himself in that particular set relative to his PR, for example. But the spinal erectors are the long muscles that run up your lower back and together with your core are responsible for keeping your back straight during a lift. So bodybuilder sets with their higher rep count cause much more muscle fatigue, which can result in a progressively more arched back as the set progresses. Of course, it's the arching and the bending of the back which creates the opportunity for the discs to bulge because they're primarily intended to be worked in a compression that is directly down the spine. Of course, it's the rounding and arching of the back that puts you at more risk of injuries like a slipped or a herniated disc, because the discs themselves are meant to accept compression directly down the direction of the spine. So when you start to have the arch, you start to load them differentially and almost squeeze them out like a piece of wet soap in your hands. So I follow Starting Strength. That's the book that I'm operating from. It's a powerlifting book. It's not about bodybuilding. And so I was glad to find a forum post within Starting Strength website where Ripito himself responded to a fellow who was worried because a surgeon had told him he was going to need surgery for his herniated discs, and they told him never to squat or deadlift again. So within that forum discussion, Ripito and a number of the other coaches absolutely insist that you can lift and should lift after herniated and bulged discs. And they all continuously work with athletes that after a herniated or bulged disc will work to new strength limits and lift higher weights. If you end up in that situation, what you do is you start with an empty bar and make sure your form is perfect all the time and progressively add weight while maintaining that perfect form. The forum post is in the description, and there is absolutely no mistaking Ripito's opinion on the subject. Having read it though, I think personally I am not ready to push new weights yet in the coming week or so, as my back is still rounding more than I'd like it to. So I'm glad to have done this review to remind myself to always focus on perfect form first. The weights will come. I'm very lucky to have never had a crippling back injury and would certainly like to keep it that way. If you're listening to this and are considering how it might apply to your circumstances, please make sure that you have a clear understanding on the difference between the strength training and bodybuilding disciplines. Ripito's books are over 300 pages in length. So this is not casual advice. It's a very technical discipline that takes constant monitoring, study, and, where possible, coaching. I also find it super addictive personally, and you really have to pay attention to your ego because you can lift heavier if you allow your form to break, and that's where the injuries come in. So now on to the link between oil and GDP, or economy. So I decided to dive into this topic because of a recent video by Dr. Martinson of Peak Prosperity, linked into the description as well. In that video, he posted this chart showing how tightly linked oil consumption is to GDP and by extension economic growth. I was actually first introduced to this chart back in 2007 during my undergrad by a fellow named Peter Tertsakian, who came to my university during a speaking tour to promote his book called 1,000 Barrels a Second, which is in the description. In short, the bigger your economy, the more oil you consume. A more interesting way to put it is that oil is economy and economy is oil, and just let that sink in for a moment. I think a much easier statement to accept is that energy is economy and economy is energy. This would expand the definition to be not just oil, but also include electricity consumption and burning of non-oil fossil fuels like natural gas for heat instead of electricity. I think that most people can appreciate how dependent we all are on energy. Where this is interesting to me is in thinking about how to kick our fossil fuel addiction. We want to think about how we can raise or at least maintain our GDP while also using less energy, especially oil. So an important thing to understand about this plot is that it's a log-log chart. The numbers on both the horizontal and vertical axes indicates how many zeros the number has. For example, the countries in the lower left have a log oil consumption of 2.7-ish, which means around 500 barrels per day. A log GDP of 8 corresponds to around 100 million GDP. These are the Pacific Island nations of Nauru and Kiribati, which have less than 200,000 people combined. Then in the top right, you have China and the US with log oil consumption of 7.1 and 7.3, which is 14 and 20 million daily barrels of oil consumption, and then a log GDP of 13.15 to 13.3, which works out to 14 and 21 trillion dollars of GDP. So that's a really big spread in these countries, and the log-log chart helps to display them all in a meaningful way. The slope of the chart is 1.04, so pretty darn close to 1. That means that if a country adds a zero to its GDP, to go from 1 million to 10 million, for example, it'll also end up adding a zero to its oil consumption, approximately. So from 100,000 to 1 million barrels of oil daily consumption. When you put it that way, it's kind of intuitive. I can't help but suspect that the same would be more or less true of electricity and many other commodities like metals, copper, natural gas, things like that. Those would all be topics for another video. More precisely, a slope of log 1.04 means that for an $11 rise in GDP, that should correspond to around 10 barrels per day of extra consumption. I'm using the EI data set, which goes back to 1980 for most countries, so we can see how that number has changed. So back in 1980, increasing oil consumption by 10 barrels per day would likely correspond to an increase in GDP by about $8.2. So that's $8.2 rise in GDP in 1980 versus an $11 rise in GDP today. So that's about a 34% increase. If we look at the trend line, we can see 4 countries that kind of stand out above the trend line. So these are Macau and Switzerland, which are 2 countries whose economies are mainly driven by casinos and banking, respectively. And then Congo, Brazzaville, and Cote d'Ivoire. These are 2 Western African countries whose economies are disproportionately driven by oil. Then there's one country which is way below the trend line, and that's the Caribbean island of Martinique. Checking their energy profile, turns out that their electricity grid is powered 75% by diesel fuel, so I imagine that's one of the main reasons why they've got such a high oil consumption for their GDP. Speaking of islands, another piece of information we can glean out of this chart is the y-intercept of the trend line. It presents an interesting little thought experiment, because the y-intercept is what the log GDP is when log oil consumption is 0, which corresponds to 1. So that means that if we were to imagine a fictional, isolated, small island nation with a daily oil consumption of 1, because log 1 equals 0, then what does the trend line tell us that this GDP would be? And the y-intercept is 5.61, which corresponds to around $365,000. So according to this trend line, our fictional island with a log oil consumption of 1 barrel per day would have a GDP of around $365,000. Going one step further, since 1 barrel per day equates to 365 barrels per year, that means that each barrel is producing around $1,000 of GDP. And this actually lines up kind of well if we try to view the data without using the log axes. So notice that I am using annual oil consumption for the x-axis this time instead of daily. And if we now look at the trend line, we see that the trend line is $2,724 of GDP per barrel of oil consumed in a year. But also notice that the y-intercept is now negative, so the trend line fit is clearly not perfect. But when we look in this way, it really shows how much influence the two big economies have over this trend line. And I think we have to take that seriously. If this much oil is being required by these behemoth economies, then the relationship is obviously very strong. But let's look at some of the smaller economies. If we instead zoom into the rest of the world's economies, we see some pretty huge variations from country to country. So this makes for an interesting comparison because way above the line you have Japan, Germany, France, United Kingdom, Italy. And then below the line you have the BRICS countries minus China, like Russia, Brazil, India, and then you got Mexico and Iran. So the nations above the line are producing a lot more economy for a lot less oil. Meanwhile, the nations below the line are using a lot more oil than the size of their economy would suggest. We're not getting into anything about price or dependence or any of those things. So while the log graph paints a pretty compelling picture, there's a lot of detail and nuance in there for those of us who are trying to forge a path towards a future where prosperity is decoupled from oil. So that's it for this video, but there's so much data here that I'll be doing 1 or 2 more videos on this data set coming up. So maybe see you in the next one. As always, I'm glad to see comments and or suggestions on other topics to explore. Thanks very much for joining, and take care.